I'm Alanna Burke, and this is the critical role of documentation in open source success. I work at Amazy.io, which is a Mirantis company. I'm the community manager for Lagoon and a developer advocate. I also write our documentation. I was a backend Drupal developer for a long time, and then about 4 years ago, I switched over to doing documentation and training, and I haven't ever been happier.
Need to learn Kubernetes quickly? Check out our free ebook with hands-on exercises you can complete on your laptop over a short break or lunch. Visit mirantis.com/learnkates to download now.
So we're going to go over a handful of things today, including what is documentation, why is it important, what makes for good docs, what makes for bad docs, what leads to documentation failure, what are the consequences of bad docs, changing your culture, and what to try if it doesn't work. So first off, what is documentation? So obviously when we think about documentation, we think about documentation that guides the users. It explains the code. And especially in open source documentation, it establishes processes, it establishes code standards, and ensures quality consistency across a wide variety of contributors coming from different backgrounds. It also very critically onboards new users and contributors. And again, especially in open source, it ensures continuity. You may have over the lifetime of a project, many different people working on something, and you want to make sure that there's continuity and consistency throughout the life of the project. And what makes open source documentation different from, say the documentation that you create for a closed source project inside of a company? Documentation for an open source project may be the only line of support. There's not necessarily a support team behind an open source project. And that makes it critical to the project's success. If no one knows how to use the project or how to install it, the documentation is going to be the only way to know how to use it. Open source documentation is most often community maintained by contributors. It's also got a sort of meta documentation going on where the documentation instructs on how to contribute to both the documentation and to the project itself. So a project can't exist and continue to thrive without people knowing how to contribute to it. So that contribution instruction is absolutely vital. Open source documentation will also include roadmaps for the life of the project and what's coming up and what the plans are. And also historical decision making. So again, that's that continuity when people rotate in and out of open source projects as their time and lives allow. So it's important to know why historical decisions were made so that when future decision making happens, we can see the logic and the reasoning behind those decisions and apply them to future decisions. So why is good documentation in particular so important? There's a lot of reasons. Good documentation makes for better onboarding of both users and contributors. Obviously, it makes for faster troubleshooting if you can go onto the documentation and find the issue that solves what you're dealing with. Good documentation will grow your community. The more people that can understand how to use your product and how to contribute to your product, the more people will get involved. It also helps to retain your users. If people can't figure out how to use your product and how to continue using your product through updates, they will, if they can't figure out how to keep using it, they'll abandon it. But if you continue to update your documentation and tell people how to continue using it, you'll keep them. It also improves productivity. This goes along with the faster troubleshooting. If you don't have to constantly search around for how to do something, it'll save you a lot of time. That's the next one, saves time. It also helps to manage change. A good project documentation will tell when things were updated, when things were deprecated, when major changes were introduced, when breaking changes were introduced. It improves the code quality. Again, going back to those standards, making sure that everything across the entire project is, up to the same code standards, the same styles. And it avoids miscommunication. If everyone is working from the same set of documentation and everyone is on the same page, then everyone is communicating about the same thing and having the same understanding. And here's just a couple of quotes explaining why good documentation is so important. A 2017 GitHub survey says that incomplete or confusing documentation is the top complaint about open source software. I can definitely understand that. And Tech Republic says, ask a developer what her primary gripes are with open source, and documentation gets top billing and by a wide margin. So those are definitely things to think about. I thought this was a really great quote. Humans are terrible at data storage. It is so important that we get the information out of our brains and onto the paper, or in this case, generally the internet. So what makes for good documentation? Good documentation is easy to understand. It gets to the point quickly. We don't need this to be like recipes with all of that SEO fluff in there. We don't need to tell stories. We just need to tell people what they need to do. Good docs will have good visuals. We don't need extraneous visuals, but we do need the ones that will guide us through what we're doing. So if there's a complicated UI, it is very helpful to have screenshots, things like that. Good docs are vetted for accuracy. I know that in my job as for writing the Lagoon documentation, Lagoon is Amaze.io's platform. I write a lot of the documentation, but then I make sure to have my team, the people who are actually implementing all of this, I have them review it for accuracy because I'm not the one who implemented it. So I'm not the one who can check and make sure that everything that I've written is accurate. It also includes an author and a date. There doesn't necessarily need to be a name on the page, but hopefully your documentation is being hooked up to some sort of version control system like Git. So if there's a question about when or where something was introduced, you can go back and figure out who did it and when and why it was written that way. Good documentation will also address the right audience. In any given project, there is probably a variety of audiences. You might have developers, administrators, end users. So make sure that your documentation is written in a way that properly addresses each audience that might use your product. So the next few slides are some examples of open source docs that I think are really good. So this one is from some of the Kubernetes docs. And I just thought that this was kind of visually appealing. They use a variety of different visual things in here. They've got some warnings, they've got tables, they've got code, they've got lists. So they're really making sure that everything that they put on here is styled in an appropriate way. And it's not just a big wall of text. It's much, much easier to read than if this were just some kind of paragraph. But I can look through here and say, oh, here's a warning, here's a table, here's some examples, and it makes a lot more sense. Here is another Kubernetes screenshot. I liked this one because they're going through, this is some of the reference documentation, and they've got these nice tooltips for various things. So you don't have to actually click through to find out, oh, what does this acronym stand for? You can just mouse over it and say, okay, it's an API for container runtimes to integrate with Kubelet. Great, now I know what that is. I thought that was a really nice way to do that. A little more Kubernetes. I like how they have these example YAML files, and they have a button that you can copy from them. So again, oops, the next slide. Again, I just think this is really nice and easy to use. It's very straightforward. Examples, copy them. And then I think this is the last Kubernetes screenshot, but you can see at the bottom, they have when it was last modified, and then a link to the actual Git SHA of the commit that updated it. So if you, and I assume you could also update the documentation from there, but it's nice to know, if this has to get updated or you're wondering when and why this got updated, you can just go and see the actual commit in version control. This was some deeper Kubernetes documentation, some more reference documentation. And this is stuff this is really hard to make usable and user-friendly, but I thought they did a good job by sort of dividing it into sections like this. So here we're looking at the create command. They've got the usage, they have a whole table of flags. And then on the right-hand side, they've got these nice examples. So I thought that was a nice way to divide up what can be a really difficult kind of documentation to both to create and to slog through when you're trying to figure out how to use it. But I thought that this was a good way to present it, again, without making a giant wall of text. And here's one from, this is from Vue.js. And I thought this was a good way of addressing sort of both your audience and their learning style. So they tell you to pick your learning path. So if you are a hands-on person, you can go through their tutorial. If you're a person who likes to read everything and then go ahead and try it, you can just read the guide. And if you like to go through examples first, they've got a bunch of examples that you can go through and check out first. So I thought that was a really nice way of dividing up their sort of intro, getting started documentation. Let's talk about what makes for bad documentation. So I have a handful of examples here from some media modules and media types documentation from Drupal. I'm not hating on anyone here because I am part of the Drupal community, and at some point I've been asked to look at these docs, and I promise that at some point I will update them. But they were a good example of docs that have some issues with them. So this first one, I took a look at it, and it had last been updated on November of 2020, which at this point is almost 4 years ago. And for anything that is still in use as this is, that is way too old to even have been, it's never been touched since 2020, not even a tiny edit. That's bad. I also had major issues with these screenshots, and this is blown up as much as I could, and these screenshots were just tiny and blurry and unreadable. And like I said before, there are times when you need to include screenshots in your documentation to explain the UI. And in this documentation, they're attempting to explain how to use this UI, but with basically unusable and also inaccessible screenshots. You also want to make sure, if you have a project that has a lot of versions, that you are managing your documentation in a way that includes all of those versions and all of the dependencies of all of those versions. So Drupal, at the point where I screenshotted this a little while ago, the first time I gave this talk. So at that point, they were pushing an upgrade to Drupal 10. But the guide to this was about the Drupal 8 media module and included a link to the Drupal 7 media module. Those are Drupal 7 is a very old version of Drupal, and Drupal 8 is also pretty old. So these really, this is a main documentation page, and it really needs to be updated. This one was from Ubuntu. I think I had actually seen on Twitter someone complaining about how bad Ubuntu's documentation was, and I had to go look. And it's just extremely fragmented. They've got desktop, server, and installation guides here, which it's not entirely clear which one you might want. They have them in HTML, PDF. They don't have them for all of the different things here. Then they have notes saying that some of the documentation has been moved to a different site. There's source code pages. Then there's a link for more Ubuntu documentation. Now, I know that an operating system is absolutely enormous, and it's going to have giant documentation, and it's nearly impossible to keep that from being fragmented, but this is a little bit of a mess. What causes these messes? What leads to documentation failure? Docs are often everyone's problem and nobody's job. There's often no time to do documentation. It doesn't get figured in when you're estimating how long a task or a feature is going to take. There's often no incentive to create the documentation. Many developers don't have experience with writing documentation. You can run into red tape where there hasn't been, maybe you've been assigned or you've gotten a sponsor to do a certain part of the documentation, a certain part of the project, but they haven't given you any leeway to do the documentation, and there's pushback, and you just haven't gotten any buy-in. Information hoarding can be a big one. You have, especially in something like an open source project, where maybe one person has been working on it for years, and they just have all of the information in their head, and they're the person who has to do the documentation, or they have to work with someone to do the documentation, but they won't. And there's no other way to extract that information. Documentation can be hard to keep up to date. I just showed you that Ubuntu slide. It's difficult. I find keeping just one project up to date difficult. I can't imagine what it's like to keep multiple versions of an operating system's documentation up to date. And in open source, for many people, although not myself, it's not seen as the fun part of contributing. People want to contribute to an open source project and make something fun and exciting and see it work. I personally want to document it, but that's me, and that's why I do this for a living. And also, non-code contributions, sadly, are often seen as less important, especially in an ecosystem where you might be getting some kind of credit for contributions, especially if there's any kind of weight to them. Non-code contributions are often, they're weighted less, they get less credit, which is really unfortunate. And of course, there are always excuses. The code is self-documenting. It's too hard to keep it up to date. It adds too much time to my development. So what are the consequences when we have bad docs? In a case study from Google in 2014, 48% of Google engineers cited bad docs as their number one productivity issue. 50% of SRE issues cited problems with docs. And as I just said, docs were considered everybody's problem, but nobody's job. So what did they do? They made documentation radically simpler for their engineers. They created a system called G3 Docs, and it did the following. It removed decisions. They presented one way to document things, and this is the way it was going to be.
Someone was detected at your front door.
They also hosted the docs next to the code in their source in Markdown so that engineers could stay in their IDE. And then their documentation automatically got rendered into nice HTML pages on commits. I think a lot of us do something similar to this now. We have our code in Markdown, it lives in the same repository, and then we use some kind of generator to turn it into our documentation site. They also formed alliances with influential engineers in the company to introduce the tooling. So they got them on board so that they could help to get other people on board. They partnered with specific teams to build strategic integrations. They released and iterated everything in the open, and they never forced teams into the new workflow. They decided to lead by example. And I found this in an article, and I wanted to share, even though it's a little less applicable to open source, but open source software is also used by many, many companies. So I think this is still an interesting thing to look at. So if IT folks spend about 20% of their time just looking for information, if we put the average salary at about $60,000 a year, and the average hourly labor rate at about $43 an hour, and we say that about 20% of time wasted due to bad documentation, the annual cost of time waste is about $13,760 per employee, and the annual opportunity cost of time waste is about $34,400 per employee. So that opportunity cost is the amount of production that each employee could have produced had they not been wasting their time looking for things. Most IT service providers charge about 2.5 times the hourly rate. So in this example, it's about $107 an hour. So in a 10-employee company, we're looking about $481,000 in waste every single year. So if good documentation could cut that number in half, who wouldn't want to save $240,000 a year? It's a pretty big number. And I firmly believe that bad docs are worse than no docs. If you have no docs, then you're just on your own, you're figuring it out. But if you have bad docs, you're wasting time, it's leading you astray, and it's extremely frustrating. So let's talk about what we can do to change your culture. Culture is not immutable. No matter what's going on, you can help it to change. So we've got 5 things we're going to do. 1 is start from the top. 2, choose someone to drive it. 3, make it easy. 4, start with standardization. And 5, empower contributors. Start from the top. Establish that clear, concise writing is the expectation from everyone. Make sure that everything that gets written is clear, concise, accessible, and inclusive. Don't use jargon or make any kinds of assumptions. And have your maintainers lead by example with quality writing. Like in the Google example, if people who are influential in the project.
Someone was detected at your front door.
Sorry, my doorbell keeps going off. I can unplug it. Maintainers, if like in the Google example, if we can get the influential people in the project to lead by example by writing documentation and writing high quality documentation, then other people will follow suit. Choose someone to drive it. Make someone responsible for managing documentation or reviewing all doc-related pull requests. And this could be one person if you're lucky enough to have a large community. Maybe you're creating working groups. One of your very first working groups should be a documentation group to make sure that you're getting all of this done, that someone is in charge, someone is reviewing all of the doc-related pull requests. And this person or group is also creating all of the templates, the trainings, and any other support needed to create the docs. Make it easy. Choose tools that integrate into existing workflows. If you know what your developers are using, make it easy for them. Let the developers stay in their editor. Markdown is very popular for a reason. It's straightforward, it's easy, it's code. Use Git or another version control to let everyone contribute as they see fit to save all of the history. Again, we talked about in the very beginning that documentation saves historical decisions. So using a version control lets us not only see the history of the code, but we can see all of the issues and the discussions and everything that has happened to get us to where we are today. And ensure everyone has access. If people have to go and ask for access to update the documentation, they're probably not going to do it. When you set up the documentation and however it's going to be updated, go ahead and proactively grant that access to everyone who should be updating the documentation. And also automate whatever you can. There is so much to be automated through version control workflows with continuous integration, continuous development. There shouldn't be any sort of manual publishing. Almost every documentation setup that I know of includes just basically writing Markdown, putting it in a certain folder, setting up a whole bunch of automation, and when you push it to a certain branch, it gets published and everybody's super happy. This also means it's really easy to update the documentation, especially if you keep sort of a parallel documentation branch that can be updated without the main branch of your code being updated. It's really helpful. And start with standardization. Establish a tool set. Create templates that include documentation and merge requests. So anytime that someone is creating a merge or pull request, make sure that you're requesting that documentation from them right there. And then further ensure that all doc-related merge or pull requests are tagged as docs and request a review from a doc maintainer. You can also create a style guide to make sure that all of your documentation is created in the same voice. You can automate with spell checkers and linters. I think I've encountered with a variety of developers and engineers that they feel that they're not good writers, or that their writing is poor, or they think they have bad grammar, or that they're bad spellers. And I try to tell them that 1, we can automate some of that, and 2, it's fine. Just get it down on paper and I can edit it. So make sure you have an approval process. This goes into making sure everything is tagged and requesting a review. So you can also put this in your templates, establish if this is a doc pull request, make sure that you tag Susie in it. And establish a maintenance schedule. This is also something that should come from the doc maintainers or doc working group, that the docs will be reviewed, quarterly, yearly, etc., to keep them up to date. So here's a case study from Twitter. It's a little old, but I thought it was also pretty relevant. In 2014, Twitter only had 3 technical doc writers. So they decided to encourage documentation via education and special doc days. So they built a new docs as code stack, which they called DocBird, and they created a lot of documentation templates. So then they would organize these doc days, which were single-day hackathons where developers had to update their docs. Technical writers would give training on that day and help edit the final docs. So the bigger purpose of these days was to evangelize and normalize documentation as a practice. So it built community and a common set of expectations about documentation. So they made it easy, they made it standardized. DocBird was a customized wrapper around Sphinx. It was really similar to what Google did with G3 docs. And as we just talked about automation, it built the documentation from source automatically. And it removed all of their questions about where the docs were and how they were built. And here are just a few of the open source documentation tools either I love or I know that a lot of other people love. There are dozens, hundreds of them out there, but these are some popular ones. Obviously, there is Markdown, there's Read the Docs, there's Make Docs, and there's a lot of really amazing themes for Make Docs. I just want to give a shout out to Material because we really love that theme. There's Sphinx, there's Doxify, there's Docusaurus, and the doc puns continue if you search for more documentation tools. But this is a good list to start from if you're looking to get started at creating open source documentation with open source tools. A case study in a Fortune 500 company, there was a company that was contracted to work with this client, and they helped reduce their content overload and increased content reuse by 20% year over year by organizing their documentation. They helped reduce support calls by 35%. And they also designed guidelines for their client that they would implement as the standards for future releases. So they basically went in, updated and cleaned up their documentation and gave them a roadmap for going forward. And it was really effective for them. And make sure that you empower your contributors. This is so important. Like I said earlier, make sure that you are proactive in giving everybody access. Use a system that allows for contribution from everyone. Like I said, using Git is really great. It's so easy to put an edit link into all of your documentation so that people can just click on it, update something, and put in a merge request. I do this frequently if I just see a quick typo or something in somebody's docs. I would be so upset if I found a typo in my docs. So I know that I would want somebody to fix that. So just little things like that, even. Make sure that you give training on how to write docs. Like I said, not everyone is comfortable writing. People think that they can't write or that they don't know how to write. So empower them, give them the tools that they need to learn how to write documentation. Create a positive feedback loop. I know that in my job, I can feel like I am always asking for things, begging for things, nagging people, saying, hey, I need this, I need this, I need this. So I also try to make sure that every time that somebody does, write the documentation, give me the information, that I'm thanking them, that I'm saying, hey, this is great, look at this. So make sure that this isn't, when you're trying to get documentation done, don't make it a negative thing. Make sure that it's always a positive, that we're always being happy about the documentation that's being created, that we're always positive about it. And what kind of goes along with that is allow everyone to have a sense of ownership over the docs. If it's just seen as one person's job, I think it can sort of fall on that person to shoulder all of the responsibility, but it's really everyone that works on the project. And then finally, if you go through all of this and it doesn't work, what do you do? So I have a few suggestions here. The first one is simply to not accept merge requests that don't include needed documentation updates. Just keep rejecting them and telling them that they need to add the documentation. Also, in your contribution guides, make sure that doc writing is an official part of project development. Make it very clear that nothing is going to be accepted if it hasn't, if it doesn't have the documentation included with it. And as we were just talking about, making sure that everyone has a sense of ownership over the docs, make sure that you develop intrinsic value. Make sure that everyone, who's contributing to the project, everyone who's working on it has this sense that having good documentation is something to be really proud of, that it's something really great. And I think that that will start to, sort of permeate the culture of the team, the contribution, the community, and it will make people want to make the docs better. Okay, so I think we are going to go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you so much for everyone who attended. This will also be available on demand as a Mirantis Tech Talk, so keep an eye out for emails from Mirantis. And I'm so glad that you attended. Thanks so much, everyone.